Sid Slagter, welcome to Keating Interviews.
Well, thank you for having me on today.
Pleasure having you here today. This is exciting. You're helping compile a book on veteran stories. Tell me about it. I'm pretty ignorant on this one.
Well, the idea came back when I was a kid. I think that like many people my age, there was many World War II veterans in the neighborhoods where we were growing up, and I'm sure my neighborhood was very typical. It seemed like all the gentlemen in my neighborhood had war stories to tell. And I was just fascinated by those stories. And in fact, we would pester those World War II vets to tell us more stories. And some of them were very reluctant, but others had some pretty good stories to tell. And so even back then, when I was a young boy, I decided that someday I'm going to write down these stories. So when I saw the Chicken Soup books doing well, and we know that we have many Chicken Soup co-authors in this town. We have Marci Shimoff and Jennifer Hawthorne, who did Chicken Soup for the Mother Soul, and Kline, who did Chicken Soup for the Pet Lover Soul. And when I saw those Chicken Soup books doing good, I thought, here's the way to get those stories told. They need to do a book on veterans. Since I already had stories collected from over the years, I sent in some stories to Jack Canfield and Mark Victor Hansen, the two men that started the Chicken Soup series. And they read those stories and they loved them. And they got back to me and said, get to work right away. This is exactly what we want.
Wow, that's cool. You get the book, want to show us the book here so
sure.
people can get a look?
I have a copy right here.
And let me see if I can fade the camera in here a little bit.
All right.
Yeah, it has a similar cover to the other ones.
Right. Yeah, we were looking for something, patriotic, and because all of the stories about our American vets, those that have served so honorably and fought so bravely, we really wanted to make it very patriotic. And given the events of September 11th, it's very timely that we did that. And nothing like looking back to what our veterans have done in the past to give us confidence that we'll get through these tough times that we're going through right now.
Tell me about the book, or what the process you wanted to communicate today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the book came out on May 15th of this year, and it's been doing very well. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for about almost 3 months, rising up to number 6, I believe, and continues to sell well. We get many great letters and emails every day from veterans and their families and others that have read the book and say they love the stories. But actually, it took about 2.5 years of work, and what we did was, when we had the idea to do it, we needed a lot more stories. So what we did is we contacted all the veterans groups around the country, the VFW, the American Legion, and many, many others, and we told them what we were doing, and they recognized the Chicken Soup name. That opened up a lot of doors, and so they were very eager to have their members send in stories. So they ran little announcements in their newsletters, in their magazines, on their websites, and that went out to all their members around the country, even around the world, and the stories came pouring in. We received over 4,000 stories. They still continue to come in. 4,000 story submissions for this book. And we received stories from all over the world, from all branches of service. We had stories that go back to the Civil War. People that are old enough to remember the Civil War veterans that were in their hometowns when they were growing up. And so we just got a huge wide range of stories. And collecting the stories was the easy part. In fact, there was days when the mailman would deliver an entire carton of mail to our office right here in the Broadway building where we were working at the time, because the letters were coming in so fast. But the hard part was choosing which stories to get into the book, because there's 92 stories in the book, and for every good story that's in the book, there's a half a dozen great stories that just couldn't make it in, at least into this volume.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What was the biggest challenge of everything you did?
Once again, just collecting the stories. And I have to tell you, there was many, many days when my wife and I were just in tears reading the stories that were sent in. So many great stories about, just incredible sacrifice that, these men and women went through. And if there was any one overriding theme that came through, was how quickly all these men wanted to honor their buddies. Instead of talking about themselves, they wanted to talk about a special buddy, a friend that got them through some tough times, and in many cases didn't return. To these men, even though they may be in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they're getting much older, the World War II generation, their buddies are still very much alive in their memory, and they wanted so badly to pass on a story about a buddy that was special to them. So that was very touching to see that.
There's a spirit that's captured then here in these stories. Well, what is that spirit? What does it speak of, or what is it?
Oh, yeah, easy to describe. It's just that camaraderie that's developed amongst people that serve together, especially in battle. And just also, too, just how much these people put aside their own, little concerns when they had such a bigger purpose that they were all working toward. In the case of, World War II, I mean, we were fighting for our very freedoms. It was not, the outcome was not a given assumption when we entered World War II. In fact, many of the first battles that the American troops fought in, they lost. So the outcome of World War II was not given. And so these men, I mean, they just really pulled together, and they talk about the teamwork that it took to get the job done. And so many of them, when they wrote their stories, once again, they did not want to focus on themselves, saying, I didn't do anything. I was just a member of a team. And so when you read these stories in the book, that really comes through. Just once again, those buddies, the teamwork, the camaraderie that came through. So that's really the spirit of the book.
It's a very unique human experience that only comes in those moments that are crucial, do or die situations. And to have that brought out in a book format is a very rare kind of opportunity or experience to capture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in fact, that was one of our goals with Chicken Soup for the Veteran Soul. There's many books on World War II. I mean, you can go to the library, you can look on the bestseller list. They're coming out all the time. I mean, movies are still continue to be made on World War II. But we really wanted to capture something a little bit beyond just telling a war story. Certainly the stories in the book are that. But there's something more that can come out. We know that war is probably one of the most horrible experiences that anyone can go through. And certainly that came out in the thousands of letters that we got, was just how horrible it was. But there's something else that can rise above it. So like in the stories that you read, like the very first chapter, we call it the warrior spirit. And once again, it was just that quality of people who look deep inside themselves and find that they have something that they didn't know existed. And they use those qualities, to overcome some, incredibly bad situations and come through, and to show that, that pride that comes with service.
So basically there's a juncture point, a very crucial juncture point that these people are faced with. Mm-hmm. And they have an opportunity to make a very significant surfacing or resurrection out of that deep, despondent or dark situation.
Right.
And that is a human capability, a human faculty
Mm-hmm.
that's there within each of us. And yet it doesn't really surface until we're put in that situation where we're faced to go forward or we perish.
Exactly, right, yeah. And so many of them, they wrote these stories and said, I was just a young kid. A lot of them lied about their age. They went in when they were, 16, 17 years old, but hey, they were big, strong, farm boys, and, they certainly could pass, and the government needed them, so they didn't really question them. And a lot of them did have the permission of their parents to go in early. And, they never thought about it. Sure, they thought they were fighting, for country and for freedom and all those things. But once again, they really attribute it to their training. Thank goodness these boys were trained, very well. And they really developed a sense of what it means to serve, to take orders and to listen to their commanding officers. And so many of them said that, if they hadn't paid attention in basic training, they could have never have done the job that they did. Because when it came down to it, they were very scared. I mean, every one of them says, if you weren't scared, you were a liar, because every one of them was scared. But what they did was they just fell back upon their training. They fell back upon the trust that their buddies would do the same job. And also, they didn't want to let their buddies down. They knew that, they were operating at a team. If they didn't do their job, men would get killed. And so time and time again, these men wrote that said, sure, I was scared, but I just had to look around, see that my buddies were there next to me, and just get the job done. And what happened was, so many of them said that they immediately realized, sure, they were fighting, for country, for freedom, and, to preserve, everything that looked to be lost. And but what they realized was, I'm fighting for that guy next to me too, to get him home safely, because I sure want to get home safely.
There's this mechanism I want to go back to, because I can see it's such a rare thing to experience that dynamic where it comes to a focus and a choice has to be made, a decision has to be made, and I have to do it. That's a very rare experience for a human being to have. A lot of human beings will never have that experience. And yet, it seems like it would serve us today in our lives somehow, for each of us to go forward somehow, being faced with some difficulty, some obstacle, someplace we don't want to go. Can you think of making a connection between those stories and my personal life or anyone's personal life today?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly what, the book is about was just, overcoming, those fears and those obstacles, thinking, oh, I can't do this. But then looking deep inside. And it's absolutely true. I mean, we have a wonderful, comfortable life here in the U.S. I mean, let's face it, we have one of the, the highest, standards of living in the world. I mean, we complain when we get a few inches of snow on the ground that, oh, now I can't drive somewhere. But all we have to do is, look at those scenes from like Afghanistan, where people have lost everything after, years and years of war. And you have to wonder, do we really have, that moral fiber, that, that courage to overcome it, and when we are put to the test. And sometimes I think maybe we're not tested that well. Sure, maybe our car gets stuck in the snow and we think, oh, this is such a horrible thing. Or actually, I have to laugh too. I was watching something on the Travel Channel, and they were interviewing people that had gone whitewater rafting. And these people were talking about, oh, that was the most adventurous thing I've ever done. Okay, sure, maybe it was. But when you compare that to stories of, men who have served in combat, have been under fire, have gone through, artillery barrages that have lasted for, half a day while they were huddled in a foxhole, often sometimes in freezing conditions. Those were the guys that were really tested. And, and those are, we look at that World War II generation. I think Tom Brokaw summed it up perfectly, saying, that's the greatest generation. And it's something that we really need to look back at, even if we're never tested ourselves, just to really look at those guys who have been tested and just see what we can learn from them.
Wow. That would be helpful in a daily situation where, let's say there's a couple who are at odds with each other, husband, wife, and they go, can I take another step forward here from my fear or my closed space and try and make this work better?
Yeah, interesting you say that about couples, because many of the stories that we received, they talked about what it meant, to have someone back home writing them. And in a lot of cases, these guys got married, just days before they went into service. They figured, hey, may never come home again. This is the girl that I love. And, they talk about all those letters that they got. In fact, there's a couple of really sweet stories in the book about, the letters that were exchanged sometimes over years until they saw each other again, and when they came back home, they were just, it was the thought of that person back home waiting for them, and that kept them going, and then they went on to have, a great life together, 60-some years of marriage or more. And, it's just a wonderful thing. And, and that was just that bond that, just to keep going through, talk about adversity, just tough times. But, just there's something in their heart just kept them going.
Wow. It seems to me, too, that these stories would have a healing value for some of the veterans that maybe came back, and by reading that story, they can kind of go back to that place and heal. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. One of the biggest goals of the book was the healing. Even after so many years, so many decades, there's so many scars that are being carried by what they went through, those experiences of war. And, we know today, they talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome that can come up even after, 40, 50 years. Someone who served in World War II, it can still resurface. And the Vietnam vets, that's when it really came to the forefront. So one of our big goals of this book was to write stories that dealt with healing. And I have to say, I think we did a pretty good job, because I get so many letters and emails from the Vietnam generation saying, I came back to this country and I was never thanked, for what I did. I was basically scorned, for the fact that I served my country during a war that was, very questionable about, what our motives were and whether we were, was proper and right. But given the fact that they went and served, there's something extremely honorable about that, that they answered the call of their country. But these men, they still carry a lot of deep wounds. I mean, mentally and physically. And it's just necessary just to talk about it. And one of the sweetest emails I got was from a man who has a story in a book. He's a Vietnam vet. And he struggled with that for many years, and he sent in a story, and it got published. And because of that, he's getting a lot of responses saying people have read his story and they really liked it, and they're thanking him for his service, they're thanking him for telling his story. And he sent me an email and he said, Sid, I have never been so proud to have worn the uniform of my country after having the ability to tell my story and get it out to the public. And I tell you, I almost started crying. I called him back and I said, you have made this whole effort worthwhile just by telling me that, you know, now after all these years gone by, how you can feel so good about what you did, how you served your country.
That's magnificent. That's magnificent. It's a beautiful thing, the human, a lot of those men and shove that experience down.
Yes.
Push that sucker way down in there, and I'm not going to deal with it.
Right.
And then some 20, 30 years later, it's ready for healing.
Mm-hmm.
And then comes these stories.
Right.
And while the man is now ready for the healing, the story comes to meet him.
Right.
He gets the healing and communicates that with you.
Yeah, we've heard from many families. It was many of the family members who were the ones who wrote down their stories about their fathers or mothers or their grandfathers and the grandmothers who served, saying, you know, they'd kind of heard just little bits of stories over the years, over the decades, stuff would came out, and then they finally sat down and said, you know, Grandpa, you've really got to tell us your story. They said, you know, after 40-some years, 50 years, the story just came pouring out. And they were amazed. You know, here was this man that they'd known their whole adult life. Never knew, you know, that he had medals, that he, you know, got a Bronze Star, he got a, you know, Purple Heart, he got, you know, Combat Infantry Badge, you know, for serving in combat. And they were just amazed that they had a hero in their own family. And so we've really encouraged people saying, now is the time to sit with your parents, your grandparents, and get these stories, because once they're lost, they're gone. And these are the best witnesses to history, those who saw it live. You know, you can read a book about history, you can watch Saving Private Ryan thinking that you're, you know, learning something, but it's nothing like sitting with a veteran who saw it live to just to capture that detail, you know, the fear, you know, the emotions that were running, you know, the action or whatever. And these people are right in their own families. And more so, the need is we're losing our World War II generation at the rate of 1,000 to 3,000 a day. Meaning that these stories are fading fast. So we really need to capture these stories to get them down so we can read from them, learn from them, and just know what a great job that they did for us.
Yes, and for our children and grandchildren, there's a legacy that's passed in
Right.
knowing, you mean my great-grandfather this and that?
Mhm.
Yeah, here's the story.
Exactly, right. Here's his medals, here's his uniform. A lot of them still, you know, the uniform is up in an attic somewhere. Doesn't fit anymore because they were, you know, 18, 19 years old when they wore it, but sure, yeah. I mean, pretty soon those will be the things that we'll look back in museums and say, wow, you know, this is what they used to wear. But, you know, as it is right now, they're still alive. They're still around us.
Well, there's something very personal when that was my grandfather doing it, and he's got the story written out or on videotape or something like that. That's very wonderful for a great-grandchild who never knew that person to actually kind of get a connection.
Exactly.
With. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, great.
You have some in your family, some vets, or?
Yes, yeah,
Did
yeah.
you bring a picture to show?
Well, actually, I have a picture. It's not for my family, but just to kind of answer your question,
Okay.
one of my inspirations for this book was I have an uncle who served as he was a young lieutenant in World War II. And, you know, I'd gone through, you know, officers training, and he was assigned, he was the commanding officer of an anti-tank platoon. And his very first action in Holland, he landed there a few days after the Operation Market Garden, and he was told to pull his position forward. And so he was bringing his anti-tank squad up to a forward position, and an Army patrol came back, and the sergeant on that patrol said, "Don't go any farther. We're deep in enemy territory here. We don't control these lines." My uncle, being a young lieutenant, said, "What? I was ordered to, you know, set up position here." The sergeant said, "I'm telling you, you're way too far forward." And so my uncle said, "Well, but I have my orders." Sure enough, within minutes, he was surrounded by the Germans and captured. This is his first action. He was only in Holland for a week. Spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. And fortunately, the Red Cross notified his young wife back home, and he was able to keep somewhat in contact with them, you know, over the next, you know, year that he was a prisoner. But at the same time, you know, toward the end of the war, they marched him, you know, through the bitter cold as the Americans were advancing, you know, from one direction and the Russians from the other. They marched him north, and he froze his feet. They starved him. But he said one day the German guards disappeared and the Russian tanks came rolling in and liberated him. So to this day, he has such a soft spot in his heart for the Russians because they were the ones that liberated him. But once again, hearing these stories when I was a young boy, I was just fascinated, and I thought someday I'm going to write these down.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
So the picture that I have, I want to tell you about. It's one of my favorite stories in the book. And just briefly, I'll tell you the story. It's about a young sailor in World War II. His name is Elgin Staples. And this young sailor was serving aboard the USS Astoria, a battleship off the coast of Guadalcanal during the Pacific battle for that island. And his ship was attacked by the Japanese during a nighttime surprise attack, and this young sailor, Elgin Staples, was blown overboard when his ship was hit by enemy fire. He found himself, falling, through the air many, many feet down below into the surface of the Pacific Ocean. And when he hit the water, he was able to properly inflate his lifebelt. He pulled the trigger and inflated properly, and it kept him afloat during that long night while the battle raged around him. And he was rescued the next morning when the battle was over. He was picked up by another American ship. And while he was on board that ship, he had time to think about what he had gone through, and he decided to hang on to that lifebelt. That lifebelt had saved his life, and he memorized the inspector's number. There was a tag on the lifebelt that said it was made by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. And it had a serial number for the inspector who had passed the test of that belt. He thought, I'm going to hang on to this lifebelt. This thing saved my life. He was able to return home many months later on leave to recover from his wounds, and he was from Akron, Ohio. And so I thought, that's interesting. This lifebelt was made in this town. So while he's home, he's telling his story. His family is gathered around the table, and he's telling the story to his family about his battle and his adventures and about how the lifebelt saved his life. And he laid the lifebelt on the table to show his family, and his mother picked up the lifebelt, read that inspector's label on the lifebelt, and said, son, that's my inspector's number on this lifebelt. I work at the factory. I made this lifebelt that saved your life. So all the way around the world, his mother reached out to save her son during World War II. Now, there's a story behind that story. It's one of my favorite stories. And Elgin Staples is very much alive. We just met him in Los Angeles back in November, and he's got great stories to tell. But he kept telling us over the year that we were working with him to write a story and to get it in the book, he kept telling us, there's a picture of me, the lifebelt, and my mother somewhere. He goes, I saw it years ago when the picture was taken, when Firestone Tire and Rubber found out this incredible coincidence. They had him in and they took publicity shots. And he said, I've lost this photograph. I can't find it. I wish I had that photograph. Well, my wife Eileen and I looked for 2 years, called everywhere saying, where can we find this photograph? Anybody know? We called Firestone. They said, well, if we have it, it's in our archives. We called the archives, and they said we wouldn't even know where to look. There's so many boxes of old records from World War II just stashed away somewhere. Well, we managed to find the man who was a photographer for Firestone back in the 40s, and he says, I know where that picture is. I know exactly where to look. And so he was able to go through the archives, and he found the photograph. And so after this picture was missing for over 40 years, and if you can zoom in on that properly, what you'll see is a young Elgin Staples. He's only 19 years old.
Tip it toward, yeah, me. That's good. That's
Okay.
the glare off it. And
Yeah.
let me just zoom back here again. Actually, I'm going to zoom in right in on the, that's not in focus. Hang on. This is fun. I got a different camera here. I'm right on the belt itself, her hands and his hands.
Right.
That's kind of what I'm showing right now.
Yeah.
Real close up.
Yeah, so that's the lifebelt with the inspector's label that was showed was made by the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company.
And then the two people, who are the two people?
Right, so that's young Elgin Staples as a sailor in World War II, 19 years old, and that's his mother who worked as the inspector at the Firestone Tire and Rubber plant.
Wow.
So we were able to find this photograph, and we presented it to Elgin Staples back in November, at the end of November. We were at an awards ceremony in Los Angeles, and in fact, this award ceremony will be on the History Channel in February. And we were able to present him with this photograph that he hasn't seen in many, many years, and he was so touched he started crying, and of course made all of us cry too.
Oh, I can imagine.
So just a really nice way to honor a man who's service to our country, and just the incredible coincidence, something that just got him through. It's just one of those great stories.
I'm digging it too from the mother's point of view, that
Right.
her hand was on her son's, well, around her son
Exactly.
while he was in the Pacific, and,
Right.
and then he brings it back. The story comes all the way back across the
Right.
world again,
Yeah.
full circle, and
Yeah.
what a beautiful story.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
What's given you the most satisfaction personally about this whole process of
Oh,
compiling?
just the wonderful feedback that we get from our veterans. So many of them say that they've read the book, that they love the stories, and they get back to me and say, thank you so much for telling our stories. And for the healing aspect, like I said, just the letters that we get from especially the Vietnam generation saying, thank you so much for letting us know, even though we may have lost that battle, you know, essentially we won in the sense that, you know, we have our pride, we know that we served honorably, and that we went there, we were asked by our country to do a job, right or wrong, and we did it. And it was just so great just to see that after so many years that they can feel good about themselves.
Yeah, personally, Sid,
Right.
I commend you for doing this because I know from friends of mine what wounds were brought back.
Right.
And lack of closure, feeling that they weren't good enough, no welcome back, and a lot of real mixed emotions on the part of those men who served
Right.
to come back. And then if now there's been some blessing for them to restore and renew and heal some of those wounds, and even to turn around 180 degrees and take pride, that is a
Yeah.
real wonderful thing
Right.
you've done, and I acknowledge you personally for
Oh,
doing that.
well, I can't believe I get to do this.
Yeah, that's great.
I mean, I'm having the time of my life. It's something I've always wanted to do, and now that I find myself doing it, it's just you know, a dream come true. And I get to meet the greatest people in the world, you know, those that served our country. And you know, I've met, you know, Medal of Honor recipients who, you know, are our nation's highest award for valor, and just those that, like I said, just, you know, answered their call and did their job with honor and dignity, and you know, are proud to have served. So, my great pleasure.
Sid Slagter, thanks for being a guest on Keating Interviews.
Oh, Keating, thank you so much for having me.